If you enjoyed this audiobook, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the audiobook. Chapter 1, The Heart of Every Deal. Part 1, People Before Problems. When Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands with PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn in 1993, the world witnessed something extraordinary. Before that historic moment, negotiators spent months not discussing territory or policies, but understanding each person's deepest fears and hopes. They recognized that behind every negotiation sits a human being with emotions, pressures, and personal stakes that often matter more than the official talking points. Most negotiations fail not because the numbers don't work or the terms are impossible, but because people feel attacked, dismissed, or misunderstood. When tensions rise, we naturally shift into defensive mode, treating our counterpart as an opponent rather than a fellow problem solver. This instinctive response destroys the very foundation needed for breakthrough agreements. Consider how Chris Voss, former FBI hostage negotiator, approached a kidnapping case in the Philippines. Instead of immediately demanding the hostage's release, he spent hours learning about the kidnapper's personal struggles, his sick daughter, and mounting debts. Voss understood that the man across the phone wasn't just a criminal, but a desperate father seeking solutions. This perspective shift transformed a life-threatening standoff into a collaborative search for alternatives that address the underlying crisis. The same principle applies whether you're negotiating a salary increase or a complex business merger. Your boss isn't just a budget guardian. She's someone facing pressure from upper management while trying to retain valuable talent. The vendor isn't simply trying to maximize profit. He's worried about meeting quarterly targets while maintaining quality standards that protect his reputation. Roger Fisher and William Ury demonstrated this approach during the Camp David Accords. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin were deadlocked over the Sinai Peninsula. The breakthrough came when negotiators helped each leader understand the other's fundamental needs. Sadat needed sovereignty over Egyptian land to maintain credibility with his people. Begin needed security assurance for Israeli settlements. Once they separated these human concerns from the territorial dispute, creative solutions emerged that satisfied both leaders' core requirements. Smart negotiators invest time up front to understand the person behind the position. They ask about constraints, explore concerns, and acknowledge the pressure their counterpart faces. This isn't manipulation. It's recognition that sustainable agreements require addressing human needs alongside business objectives. When you approach your next negotiation, remember that your counterpart wakes up each morning with the same hopes and worries you do. They face demanding bosses, tight deadlines, and complex relationships just like you. Start there and watch how this simple shift opens doors that seemed permanently closed. Part 2, Listening That Changes Minds. When Microsoft's Satya Nadella first sat down with Apple's Tim Cook in 2014, most observers expected a territorial battle between tech giants. Instead, Nadella spent the entire first meeting asking questions about Apple's perspective on mobile productivity and cloud integration. He listened so intently that Cook later described feeling genuinely heard for the first time by a Microsoft executive. That conversation led to Microsoft Office appearing on iPads, generating billions in revenue and fundamentally shifting the relationship between two former enemies. Most people confuse hearing with listening. We hear words while mentally preparing our rebuttal or waiting for our turn to speak. True listening requires complete attention to both spoken words and the emotions driving them. Chris Voss, the former FBI hostage negotiator, calls this tactical empathy, the ability to recognize and articulate another person's perspective without necessarily agreeing with it. Consider how hostage negotiators approach crisis situations. When faced with an armed suspect making impossible demands, They don't argue or reason. Instead, they use techniques like labeling and mirroring that transform the dynamic completely. When someone says, "I don't trust you people," a skilled negotiator might respond, "It sounds like you've been let down before." This simple acknowledgement often defuses hostility because it demonstrates genuine attention to their emotional state. The technique of labeling involves identifying and naming the emotions you observe. Research by UCLA psychologist Matthew Lieberman shows that verbally acknowledging emotions actually reduces their intensity in the brain's amygdala. When you say, "You seem frustrated by these delays," or "It sounds like timing is really important to you," you're doing more than showing empathy. You're literally calming the other person's stress response. Mirroring takes this further by repeating the last few words or key phrase your counterpart just used. If they say, "This whole process has been a nightmare," you might respond, "A nightmare?" This isn't mimicry. It's an invitation for them to elaborate. The slight upward inflection encourages them to share more information while feeling validated. The most powerful questions often start with what or how rather than why. When Stuart Diamond, who teaches negotiation at Wharton, worked with a frustrated airline passenger whose flight was canceled, he didn't ask, "Why are you upset?" Instead, he asked, "What would make this situation work for you?" The shift from interrogation to collaboration changed everything. This approach reveals information that direct questioning never could. When Toyota negotiated its joint venture with General Motors in the 1980s, their executives spent months asking American counterparts about manufacturing challenges rather than promoting their own solutions. This patient listening revealed GM's deep concerns about quality control and worker productivity, ultimately shaping a partnership that revolutionized both companies' operations. The difference between surface listening and genuine attention becomes clear in high-stakes moments. Your counterpart isn't just sharing positions. They're revealing constraints, fears, and pressures that drive their behavior. When you truly listen, you discover the real negotiation isn't about what's being said. It's about what needs to be solved. Part 3. Finding what matters most. When former British Airways CEO Rod Eddington sat down with Iberia executives in 2009, the Spanish Airlines representatives kept insisting they needed control of key routes. But Eddington sensed something deeper. Through careful questioning, he discovered their real concern wasn't routes. It was ensuring their Spanish employees wouldn't lose jobs after the merger. Once both sides understood this core interest, they crafted protections that made the deal possible. This distinction between what people say they want and why they want it can make or break any agreement. Most negotiations stall because people argue over positions rather than exploring interests. When someone demands a 20% discount, that's their position. Their interest might be staying within budget, impressing their boss, or maintaining cash flow for other priorities. These underlying motivations create the real opportunities for creative solutions. The Harvard Negotiation Project studied thousands of business deals and found a consistent pattern. Agreements reached by focusing on interests lasted longer and created more value than those based purely on position-based compromising. Consider how Steve Jobs approached the iTunes record label negotiations. In 2003, instead of arguing over pricing structures, he explored what record executives truly feared: losing control of their content and cannibalizing CD sales. By addressing these core concerns with digital rights management and artist promotion tools, he created a platform both sides could support. To identify real interests, start with the question, why is that important to you? When someone says they need the contract signed by Friday, probe deeper. Are they facing a board deadline? Trying to close quarterly numbers? Managing a regulatory requirement? Each answer reveals different pathways to agreement. Chris Voss, the former FBI negotiator, discovered that even hostage takers have legitimate interests beyond their stated demands. In one Brooklyn bank siege, the gunman demanded a helicopter, but his real interest was escaping what he saw as a hopeless situation. By addressing his underlying need for dignity and a way out, negotiators resolve the crisis peacefully. Your own interests deserve equal attention. Before entering any negotiation, examine what's driving your position. Is it fear of looking weak? Pressure from stakeholders? Financial constraints? These honest self-assessments prevent you from getting locked into rigid positions. The most productive negotiations happen when both sides openly discuss their constraints and goals. 3M's acquisition discussions with competitors often begin with frank conversations about what each company must achieve and what they absolutely cannot accept. This transparency doesn't show weakness. It creates space for innovative solutions. Sometimes interests conflict directly, but more often they're simply different. One side might prioritize speed, while the other values thoroughness. These differences become opportunities when you stop fighting over positions and start solving for mutual success. The real question isn't what each side wants, but what each side needs to feel this agreement serves their deeper purposes. Part 4. Turning conflict into collaboration. When tensions escalate and voices rise, most people assume the negotiation has failed. But Microsoft's 1997 acquisition talks with Hotmail tell a different story. After weeks of deadlock over price and control issues, the discussions had devolved into adversarial positioning. Then, someone suggested they stop arguing about who was right and start solving the real problem together. How to scale email for millions of users while preserving what made Hotmail special. That shift from opposition to partnership changed everything. Instead of Microsoft trying to force compliance and Hotmail defending territory, both teams began sketching solutions on whiteboards. They mapped out technical challenges, user experience concerns, and integration possibilities. The $400 million deal that emerged wasn't just about money. It created a blueprint for how web-based email could evolve. The breakthrough came when they stopped fighting each other and started fighting the problem together. This transformation happens when you reframe conflict as a shared puzzle. Chris Voss learned this during his FBI hostage negotiation career, where he discovered that even life-or-death standoffs could become collaborative problem-solving sessions. The key was shifting language from you versus me to us versus the situation. Instead of saying, "You need to release the hostages," he would say, "Help me understand what needs to happen for everyone to feel safe." Harvard's program on negotiation has documented thousands of cases where this mental shift created breakthroughs. When labor negotiations at General Motors reached an impasse in 2019, facilitators helped both sides see the challenge differently. Rather than union demands versus company resistance, they framed it as how can we keep GM competitive while ensuring workers share in that success. This perspective opened discussions about profit sharing, retraining programs, and flexible scheduling that neither side had previously considered. The most powerful question in tense negotiations isn't "what do you want?" but "what would success look like for both of us?" This simple reframe invites joint creativity. When Disney was negotiating with Pixar before their acquisition, Steve Jobs initially positioned it as Disney needing Pixar more than the reverse. But when Bob Iger asked, "How do we create something together that neither of us could build alone?" the conversation shifted toward shared vision and complementary strengths. Partnership thinking requires letting go of the need to win every point. Roger Fisher and William Ury call this principled negotiation, focusing on interests rather than positions. When Southwest Airlines negotiates with airports, they don't start by demanding lower fees. They ask, "How can we work together to increase passenger volume?" This approach has led to creative solutions like revenue sharing agreements and co-marketing partnerships that traditional adversarial bargaining would never produce. The moment you invite someone to brainstorm solutions with you, the entire dynamic changes. You become problem-solving partners instead of opponents fighting over a fixed pie. Chapter 2. The Power of Words and Emotions. Part 1. Mastering Difficult Conversations. When Amazon founder Jeff Bezos held his first all-hands meeting after acquiring Whole Foods in 2017, He faced a room filled with anxious employees who feared their company culture would disappear. Rather than avoiding the tension, Bezos opened with a simple statement: "I know you're worried about what will change." That single acknowledgement transformed a potentially hostile encounter into productive dialogue. Most people approach difficult conversations like walking through a minefield, hoping to avoid triggering an explosion. Yet research from Harvard's negotiation project reveals that conversations we avoid cost organizations an average of $62,000 per year in reduced productivity and turnover. The executives who thrive don't sidestep tough topics. They master the art of addressing them directly while preserving relationships. The secret lies in preparation that goes beyond rehearsing talking points. Former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss discovered that successful, difficult conversations begin with understanding your emotional state first. Before entering any charged discussion, take 2 minutes to identify your triggers. What specific responses might make you defensive? When Southwest Airlines CEO Gary Kelly had to announce massive layoffs during the 2008 recession, he spent days examining his own fears about disappointing employees who trusted him. Every difficult conversation, by stating your positive intent explicitly. Instead of diving into the problem, share why the conversation matters to you and what you hope to achieve together. When Netflix's Reed Hastings had to explain the company's pivot from DVDs to streaming to resistant board members, he began with, "I want to share something that might challenge our thinking because I believe it's essential for our survival." The most powerful tool in difficult conversations is the phrase, "Help me understand." This simple request transforms accusations into inquiries. When employees at Patagonia pushed back against company changes, founder Yvon Chouinard consistently responded with variations of this phrase, turning resistance into collaborative problem-solving sessions. Acknowledge emotions directly rather than pretending they don't exist. Research shows that naming feelings reduces their intensity by up to 50%. If someone appears frustrated, say, "I can see this is frustrating." If you feel defensive, admit it. "I notice I'm getting defensive," which tells me this conversation is important. Create safety by establishing ground rules together. Ask, how can we make this conversation productive for both of us? This simple question shifts the dynamic from confrontation to collaboration. When Airbnb's Brian Chesky faced angry hosts after policy changes, he consistently started meetings by asking participants to help create guidelines for respectful dialogue. Transform blame statements into requests for specific behavior. Instead of "you never listen to my ideas," try "I'd like to share a proposal and get your thoughts." This approach, validated by decades of research at Harvard Business School, reduces defensiveness while increasing the likelihood of genuine engagement. The goal isn't to win difficult conversations. It's to strengthen relationships while addressing real issues. Master this balance, and you transform anxiety-inducing encounters into opportunities for deeper connection and creative solutions. Part 2. Asking the Unasked. When Reed Hastings, Netflix's CEO, first pitched the idea of shifting from DVDs to streaming, most board members remained silent during initial presentations. The real breakthrough came when Hastings asked a question nobody wanted to voice. What happens if we don't cannibalize our own business before someone else does? This single inquiry opened floodgates of honest discussion that transformed the company's trajectory forever. Most negotiations fail not because of what gets discussed, but because of what remains unspoken. The questions that hover in the air, the concerns that simmer beneath polite conversation, the assumptions that nobody dares challenge. These hidden elements often hold the keys to breakthrough solutions, yet they require tremendous courage to surface. FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss discovered this during a particularly tense kidnapping case. Instead of demanding compliance, he asked the captor, "It sounds like you feel trapped. What would need to happen for you to feel like you have options?" This question, which acknowledged the underlying emotion nobody wanted to address, created the opening that led to peaceful resolution. The art lies in crafting questions that feel safe yet penetrating. Consider how venture capitalist Ben Horowitz approaches difficult board meetings. Rather than avoiding awkward topics, he asks, "What's the thing we're all thinking but nobody wants to say?" This direct approach, delivered with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, consistently produces more honest dialogue than hours of diplomatic dancing around issues. Effective inquiry requires precise timing and careful language. During Microsoft's acquisition discussions with LinkedIn, negotiators repeatedly hit walls over integration concerns. The breakthrough came when someone asked, "If we imagine this partnership failing 2 years from now, what would be the most likely reason?" This hypothetical framing allowed both sides to discuss fears and reservations without appearing to torpedo current discussions. The most powerful questions often begin with phrases that signal safety. "Help me understand," or "I'm curious about." These openings invite explanation rather than defense. When Oprah Winfrey interviews challenging guests, she frequently uses variations of "walk me through what you were thinking when." This approach has produced countless revelations that direct confrontation never could. Sometimes the most important question is the simplest one. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy asked his advisors, "What if we're wrong?" This fundamental inquiry forced the team to examine assumptions and consider alternatives that ultimately prevented nuclear war. The courage to ask what others avoid transforms negotiations from surface-level exchanges into genuine problem-solving sessions. When you're willing to voice the questions that make everyone slightly uncomfortable, you create space for the honest conversations that actually move situations forward. Part 3. Reading the Room. When Warren Buffett walks into a boardroom, he rarely looks at the PowerPoint slides. Instead, his eyes scan faces, noting who fidgets during certain topics, who glances at their phone when specific numbers emerge, and who exchanges meaningful looks across the table. This legendary investor understands that the real negotiation happens in the spaces between words. The most expensive mistakes in business history often stem from missing these silent signals. In 2000, AOL executives noticed Time Warner's negotiators seemed unusually eager to close their merger deal quickly. The body language suggested desperation, but AOL missed the cue. Had they recognized this tell, they might have pushed for better terms instead of rushing into what became one of the worst mergers in corporate history. Your brain processes nonverbal information faster than conscious thought. When someone says, "I'm totally fine with that proposal," while their shoulders tense and their breathing becomes shallow, trust the body over the words. FBI negotiator Chris Voss discovered that suspects often revealed deception through micro-expressions that lasted just milliseconds. The same principle applies in boardrooms and coffee shop conversations. Group dynamics create additional layers of complexity. Watch for alliance patterns during team negotiations. Who consistently makes eye contact with whom before speaking? Which person do others unconsciously mirror? At Disney, executives learned to identify the informal power structures in licensing meetings by observing these subtle connections, leading to more successful partnerships. Timing reveals intentions as clearly as any verbal statement. When someone suddenly speeds up their speech or introduces new terms near a deadline, they're likely feeling pressure you haven't identified yet. During the Camp David Accords, President Carter noticed that both Sadat and Begin became more animated and spoke faster when discussing certain territorial issues, signaling areas where compromise might be possible. Virtual meetings have created new challenges for reading rooms, but the fundamentals remain. Pay attention to camera positioning, background changes, and response delays that seem longer than technical lag would suggest. Google's executive team adapted their negotiation strategies for video calls by focusing more intensely on vocal tone and word choice patterns. The most skilled observers develop what poker players call pattern recognition. They notice when someone's usual speaking rhythm shifts, when confident people suddenly seek validation from others, or when quiet individuals unexpectedly become vocal. These deviations from baseline behavior often signal the real stakes beneath surface discussions. Practice this skill by observing conversations where you have no personal investment. Coffee shops, airport waiting areas, and team meetings where you're not the primary participant offer perfect training grounds. The goal isn't manipulation, but understanding, creating space for more honest and productive exchanges that address what people actually need rather than what they claim to want. Part 4. The Emotion Equation. When Disney acquired Pixar in 2006 for $7.4 billion, most observers expected Steve Jobs to dominate the negotiations with his legendary intensity. Instead, Disney CEO Bob Iger made a surprising move that transformed the entire dynamic. Before their first formal meeting, Iger publicly acknowledged Disney's animation struggles and praised Pixar's creative genius. This emotional vulnerability, rather than traditional corporate posturing, created an atmosphere where both sides could work toward genuine solutions rather than protecting egos. This reveals a fundamental truth about negotiations that most people misunderstand. Emotions aren't obstacles to overcome. They're the actual currency of every meaningful exchange. When Chris Voss negotiated with armed bank robbers during his FBI career, he discovered that acknowledging emotions rather than dismissing them often provided the breakthrough he needed. A hostage-taker feeling disrespected by society suddenly became collaborative when Voss validated that frustration before redirecting it toward productive outcomes. The research supports this counterintuitive approach. Harvard studies show that negotiators who openly acknowledge emotional undercurrents reach agreements 40% more frequently than those who maintain purely analytical stances. Yet most business schools still teach negotiation as a rational, emotion-free process. This creates negotiators who treat feelings like inconvenient interruptions rather than valuable information about what truly matters to each party. Consider how emotions actually function in high-stakes situations. When pharmaceutical companies negotiate drug pricing with insurance providers, the discussions involve more than numbers. Insurance executives worry about premium increases affecting families they'll never meet. Pharmaceutical representatives feel pressure to recoup research investments that could fund future life-saving treatments. Skilled negotiators recognize these emotional stakes and address them directly, often finding creative solutions that pure cost-benefit analysis would miss. The key lies in distinguishing between experiencing emotions and being controlled by them. Roger Fisher observed that anger often signals violated principles rather than personal attacks. When someone becomes heated about contract terms, they might be expressing deeper concerns about fairness, respect, or future security. Asking, "What would make this feel right to you?" often reveals underlying interests that numbers alone cannot address. Practical emotion management starts with preparation. Before entering important negotiations, identify what outcomes would genuinely disappoint or excite you. This self-awareness prevents reactive decision-making while helping you recognize similar emotional triggers in others. During tense moments, labeling emotions explicitly, "It sounds like this timeline feels unrealistic to you," often diffuses tension while gathering crucial information about priorities and constraints. Smart negotiators also use positive emotions strategically. Celebrating small agreements builds momentum toward larger ones. Expressing genuine appreciation for creative ideas encourages more innovative thinking. These aren't manipulation tactics, but authentic ways to channel human psychology toward mutual benefit, transforming adversarial exchanges into collaborative problem-solving sessions where everyone's emotional needs drive better outcomes for all parties involved. Chapter 3. Turning No into Yes. Part 1. The Dance of Persuasion. When Mark Cuban faced a room full of skeptical investors in 1995, he didn't launch into aggressive sales tactics about his streaming media startup, Broadcast.com. Instead, he began with a simple question. What frustrates you most about waiting for sports highlights on television? That single moment of tactical empathy transformed resistance into curiosity, ultimately leading to a deal that would sell to Yahoo for $5.7 billion 4 years later. The most effective persuasion happens when you stop trying to convince and start trying to understand. FBI negotiator Chris Voss discovered this during countless hostage situations where lives hung in the balance. When someone says no, they're rarely rejecting your offer outright. They're expressing an underlying concern, fear, or unmet need that hasn't been addressed. Consider how Southwest Airlines approached their negotiations with Boeing in the 1960s. Rather than demanding lower prices, they reframed the conversation around Boeing's desire to penetrate new market segments. Southwest positioned themselves as the perfect testing ground for a new aircraft model that could serve underutilized routes. This reframing transformed a price negotiation into a partnership opportunity, resulting in better terms and a revolutionary business model. Validation proves more powerful than argumentation. When Disney executives initially rejected Pixar's proposal for Toy Story, Steve Jobs didn't counter with technical specifications or market research. Instead, he acknowledged Disney's concerns about computer animation being unproven with audiences. He then shared a story about how his own daughter responded to early test footage, connecting Disney's worry about audience acceptance to a parent's genuine reaction. This approach transforms skepticism into collaboration. Timing often determines whether the same message lands or fails completely. Research from Harvard Business School shows that proposals presented on Tuesdays receive 23% more favorable responses than those presented on Mondays or Fridays. But timing extends beyond calendar days. Smart negotiators recognize emotional timing too. When Reed Hastings pitched the concept of Netflix to Blockbuster executives in 2000, he chose a moment when Blockbuster was facing increasing customer complaints about late fees. Rather than attacking their business model directly, he positioned Netflix as a solution to their customer satisfaction problem. The timing aligned his proposal with their immediate pain point. Credibility builds through small demonstrations rather than grand claims. Warren Buffett often begins negotiations by sharing a mistake he made in a similar situation, immediately establishing authenticity. This counterintuitive approach creates trust because it shows vulnerability and expertise simultaneously. The most persuasive negotiators understand that resistance signals engagement, not rejection. When someone objects to your proposal, they're actively thinking about it. Your job becomes channeling that mental energy towards solutions rather than letting it crystallize into permanent opposition. Questions create more movement than statements. Instead of declaring, "This price is fair," try asking, "What would make this price work within your budget constraints?" The first approach invites argument. The second invites collaboration. This subtle shift transforms adversaries into problem-solving partners, creating the psychological space where yes becomes possible. Part 2. Overcoming resistance. When Microsoft's Steve Ballmer rejected Apple's initial iPhone partnership proposal in 2007, calling it the most expensive phone in the world, he wasn't being difficult. He was protecting his company's Windows Mobile investment. Understanding this distinction between protective resistance and outright rejection can transform how you handle pushback in any negotiation. Resistance rarely emerges from thin air. During the 2008 financial crisis, Lehman Brothers executives repeatedly stonewalled merger discussions with Barclays, not because they opposed being acquired, but because admitting vulnerability felt like surrendering their identity. Fear drives most resistance, whether it's fear of looking weak, making the wrong decision, or losing control. When someone says absolutely not to your proposal, they're often saying, "I need more information," to feel safe saying yes. The human brain processes rejection as physical pain, triggering the same neural pathways activated by actual injury. This explains why people become defensive when challenged directly. Instead of fighting this biological response, skilled negotiators work with it. Chris Voss, former FBI hostage negotiator, discovered that acknowledging someone's position actually reduces their need to defend it. When a kidnapper insisted, "I'm not letting anyone go," Voss would respond with, "It sounds like you're in a really tough spot." This validation technique transformed aggressive standoffs into collaborative problem-solving sessions. Ego presents another common barrier. When Rupert Murdoch initially refused Disney's acquisition offer for Fox's entertainment assets, insiders reported his primary concern wasn't money. It was maintaining his media empire legacy. Bob Iger recognized this and reframed the deal as Murdoch's assets gaining immortality through Disney's platform, rather than being absorbed and forgotten. The $71 billion deal closed successfully. Timing often determines whether resistance crumbles or hardens. External pressures create negotiation windows that smart dealmakers recognize. When Tesla faced production challenges in 2018, suppliers who previously demanded immediate payment suddenly became flexible with terms, understanding that Tesla's success determined their own survival. The key to dismantling resistance lies in diagnosis before prescription. Ask probing questions to identify the real concern. What would need to change for this to work? Reveals more than arguing about surface-level objections. When people explain their reasoning, they often convince themselves that compromise makes sense. Building trust requires consistency over time, but you can accelerate the process through small demonstrations of good faith. Offering something valuable upfront, even without guarantees, signals genuine intent. This approach transforms zero-sum thinking into collaborative exploration. Remember that resistance signals engagement. Someone who truly isn't interested simply won't participate. When they push back, they're mentally processing your proposal, which means movement remains possible if you address their underlying concerns effectively. Part 3. When to walk, when to bend. When Roger Fisher and William Ury first researched successful negotiations at the Harvard Negotiation Project, they discovered something counterintuitive. The most effective negotiators weren't the toughest ones. They were the people who knew exactly when to hold firm and when to adapt, treating each decision as a strategic choice rather than an emotional reaction. The difference between walking away and bending often comes down to understanding your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Chris Voss learned this during his FBI hostage negotiation career when he realized that having genuine alternatives gave him the confidence to take calculated risks. In one high-profile case, Voss's team prepared multiple backup strategies before entering negotiations, which allowed them to remain calm when the primary approach failed. Consider how Southwest Airlines approached their initial negotiations with aircraft manufacturers in the 1970s. Herb Kelleher knew exactly what operational costs they could absorb while maintaining profitability. When Boeing's initial offer exceeded their parameters, Southwest walked away and pursued Lockheed instead. This clarity about their limits ultimately led to a better deal with Boeing, who called them back with improved terms. Setting boundaries requires brutal honesty about what you can actually deliver. Stuart Diamond's research shows that most people compromise too quickly because they haven't clearly defined their non-negotiables beforehand. Write down your absolute minimum requirements before entering any significant negotiation. This exercise forces you to think through scenarios when emotions aren't running high. The cost of compromise often exceeds what's immediately visible. When Disney negotiated with Pixar in 2006, Steve Jobs initially refused their terms, even though Disney represented Pixar's largest distribution partner. Jobs understood that creative control was worth more long-term than short-term revenue. His willingness to walk away ultimately led to Disney acquiring Pixar for $7.4 billion, with Jobs joining Disney's board. Flexibility becomes valuable when it addresses underlying interests rather than surface positions. During the Camp David Accords, President Carter discovered that Egypt wanted the Sinai Peninsula back not for strategic reasons, but because it represented national dignity. Israel needed security guarantees. By focusing on these deeper needs rather than territorial disputes, they found creative solutions neither side had initially considered. Recognizing when to bend requires asking better questions. Instead of "how can I win this?" try "what would make this valuable for everyone involved?" This shift often reveals opportunities that rigid thinking misses. The key is ensuring that any flexibility moves you closer to your core objectives, not further away from them. Part 4. Small wins, big gains. When NASA's Apollo 11 mission faced a critical computer overload just minutes before landing on the moon, Mission Control didn't attempt to solve everything at once. Instead, They broke the crisis into manageable pieces, addressing each alarm individually, while building confidence with each successful resolution. This approach reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology. We're wired to respond more favorably to small, achievable requests than overwhelming propositions. Research from Robert Cialdini's studies on commitment and consistency shows that people who agree to minor requests are significantly more likely to accept larger ones later. The foot in the door technique works because each small yes creates psychological momentum. Consider how Southwest Airlines transformed from a small Texas carrier into America's most profitable airline. Herb Kelleher didn't negotiate massive route expansions or immediate national coverage. Instead, he secured small wins, one city pair at a time, one regulatory approval at a time. Each success built credibility with regulators, investors, and customers, creating a foundation for bigger victories. The neuroscience behind this approach is compelling. When we achieve small goals, our brains release dopamine, creating positive associations with the negotiation process. This biological reward system makes counterparts more receptive to continued collaboration. Daniel Kahneman's research on loss aversion shows that people fear large commitments because they represent potential significant losses. Small agreements minimize this fear while establishing trust. Breaking complex negotiations into smaller components also reveals valuable information about your counterpart's priorities. When IBM was negotiating to acquire Red Hat for $34 billion, they didn't start with the final price. They began with smaller agreements about cultural values, operational independence, and strategic vision. Each conversation provided insights that informed the larger deal structure. The key is structuring these incremental wins strategically. Start with issues where agreement seems likely, perhaps timeline preferences or communication protocols. Chris Voss, former SBI hostage negotiator, calls these no-oriented questions that feel safe for counterparts to address. Is it unreasonable to want clarity on next steps? Creates an easy win while moving toward your objectives. Timing matters significantly. Celebrate each small agreement genuinely but briefly before moving forward. This acknowledgement reinforces positive momentum without losing focus. Research by Teresa Amabile at Harvard Business School demonstrates that progress, even minor progress, is the most powerful motivator in professional situations. Smart negotiators also use small wins to test assumptions about their counterpart's flexibility. If someone readily agrees to minor schedule adjustments, they might be more accommodating on other issues than initially apparent. Conversely, resistance to trivial matters might signal deeper concerns requiring attention before attempting major agreements. The cumulative effect transforms negotiations from intimidating confrontations into collaborative, problem-solving sessions. Each small success builds the foundation for bigger breakthroughs, creating sustainable agreements that both parties feel good about implementing. Chapter 4: Winning Without Losing. Part 1: Fairness isn't 50-50. When most people think about fair negotiations, they picture splitting everything down the middle like children dividing candy. This instinct feels right, but it often leaves value on the table and creates agreements that satisfy nobody completely. Real fairness in negotiation looks different. It means each party gets what matters most to them, even if the division appears unequal on the surface. Consider the famous orange story from negotiation research. Two sisters argued over the last orange until their mother suggested cutting it in half. Later, one sister threw away the pulp after using the peel for baking, while the other discarded the peel after eating the fruit. Had they understood each other's true needs, both could have gotten 100% of what they wanted instead of 50%. This principle played out dramatically when IBM negotiated with Microsoft in the early 1980s. IBM focused on hardware profits and gladly gave Microsoft the right to license MS-DOS to other companies, a detail that seemed minor then but became Microsoft's foundation for dominating the software industry. Both parties felt they won, because each secured what mattered most at that moment. True fairness emerges when negotiators invest time discovering underlying interests, rather than assuming equal splits solve everything. Smart negotiators ask probing questions. What would make this deal feel like a real win for you? Or if you had to choose between faster delivery and lower cost, which matters more right now? These conversations reveal the currency each party values most. The key lies in distinguishing between positions and interests. When Amazon acquired Whole Foods for $13.7 billion, critics called the price excessive. Yet Amazon wasn't just buying grocery stores. They were purchasing prime real estate locations, an established organic brand, and access to affluent customers. Meanwhile, Whole Foods shareholders received immediate cash value during a difficult period for the company. Both sides got their priority outcome. Effective negotiators constantly test perceptions of fairness throughout discussions. They might say, "Let me make sure I understand what would feel equitable to you," or "How does this proposed split address your main concerns?" This validation prevents assumptions and builds trust. The most creative agreements often appear wildly imbalanced to outsiders, but feel perfectly fair to participants. When Netflix negotiated content deals with major studios, they sometimes paid premium licensing fees while accepting limited geographic rights, because rapid scaling mattered more than cost efficiency in their growth phase. Studios got higher revenues while Netflix secured the content they needed for expansion. Remember that fairness isn't about mathematical equality. It's about both parties feeling respected and receiving meaningful value aligned with their priorities. The most successful negotiators spend more time understanding what constitutes fairness for each party than calculating equal divisions. Part 2. The Secret Advantage. When Warren Buffett considers an acquisition, he spends months studying the target company's financial statements, management interviews, and industry reports before making contact. This preparation typically reveals opportunities and concerns invisible to less thorough buyers, giving him significant negotiating power before conversations even begin. Most people approach negotiations hoping their natural charm or quick thinking will carry them through. This mindset explains why so many deals fail or leave value on the table. The real advantage belongs to those who treat preparation as their primary weapon. Consider how Chris Voss, former FBI hostage negotiator, would spend hours researching a suspect's background, family situation, and psychological profile before making his first phone call. This intelligence gathering allowed him to identify emotional triggers, potential motivators, and pressure points that could save lives. Business negotiations demand similar rigor, though the stakes feel less dramatic. Information asymmetry creates power. When Microsoft negotiated early partnerships with computer manufacturers, Bill Gates understood something his counterparts missed. Software would eventually matter more than hardware. This insight, gathered through careful market analysis, positioned Microsoft to demand licensing terms that seemed modest at the time but generated billions later. Smart negotiators map 3 critical landscapes before entering any room. First, they understand their counterparts' real constraints. What approval processes must they follow? Who influences their decisions? What timeline pressures exist? Second, they identify multiple forms of value beyond money: recognition, convenience, risk reduction, timing flexibility, or relationship benefits. Third, they research comparable deals, market standards, and alternative options available to both parties. The most overlooked preparation strategy involves testing your assumptions. Toyota's negotiation team regularly role-plays difficult conversations with internal colleagues acting as suppliers or partners. This practice reveals weak points in their logic and uncovers creative solutions before real stakes enter the picture. Timing awareness separates good negotiators from great ones. Cisco's acquisition spree during the dot-com era succeeded partly because their team recognized when startups faced urgent cash needs, creating windows for favorable terms. They monitored quarterly earnings cycles, funding rounds, and competitive pressures to identify optimal negotiation moments. During actual negotiations, prepared negotiators continue gathering intelligence through careful observation. They notice hesitation patterns, energy shifts when certain topics arise, and body language cues that reveal true priorities. This real-time data gathering allows them to adjust strategies mid-conversation, capitalizing on opportunities less observant negotiators miss completely. The compound effect of thorough preparation cannot be overstated. Each piece of research, every scenario considered, and all relationship background discovered creates small advantages that accumulate into overwhelming negotiating strength. Victory becomes inevitable before words are exchanged. Part 3. Deals in the real world. Real negotiations rarely follow the clean frameworks you read about in business books. When Marcus Lemonis walks into a struggling company on The Profit, he doesn't start with theoretical positions or academic models. He begins with what matters most to the business owner sitting across from him, and that information becomes the foundation for every deal he makes. Consider how Sheryl Sandberg negotiated her initial role at Facebook. Instead of fixating solely on salary, she identified what the company truly needed: operational expertise to scale rapidly. She positioned herself as the solution to their most pressing problem, then structured compensation around Facebook's future success rather than just current cash flow. This approach transformed a job interview into a partnership discussion, creating value for both sides. The same principle applies whether you're buying a house or closing a $1 million partnership. Sarah Blakely didn't convince Neiman Marcus to carry Spanx by arguing about shelf space or commission rates. She demonstrated the product's impact by wearing it to the meeting, showing immediate results that aligned with the store's goal of helping customers look their best. The negotiation became about shared success rather than competing interests. Real-world negotiations often stall because people focus on positions instead of underlying needs. When Disney acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion, Steve Jobs could have demanded control based on Pixar's creative success. Instead, he identified Disney's core concern: maintaining quality while expanding production. The final agreement preserved Pixar's creative independence while giving Disney the innovative content it desperately needed. Watch for emotional undercurrents that drive decision-making. During acquisition talks, founders often fear losing their company's culture more than negotiating price points. Smart negotiators address these concerns directly. When Mark Benioff acquired companies for Salesforce, he frequently structured deals that preserved founding teams and company values, understanding that motivated employees create more value than cost savings through layoffs. Flexibility becomes crucial when initial strategies fail. Chris Voss teaches that successful negotiators prepare multiple pathways to yes. When one approach hits resistance, they pivot immediately rather than pushing harder on the same lever. This mirrors how great salespeople adapt their presentations based on customer reactions, reading the room and adjusting their message accordingly. Common pitfalls include rushing toward closure and ignoring implementation details. Many deals collapse not during negotiation, but during execution, when parties discover they had different interpretations of agreements. Successful negotiators invest time clarifying expectations and defining success metrics before shaking hands. The most powerful negotiators treat every interaction as relationship building rather than zero-sum competition. They understand that today's counterpart might become tomorrow's business partner, creating long-term value that extends far beyond any single transaction. Part 4. The Art of the Follow-Up. When Mark Benioff negotiated Salesforce's acquisition of Slack in 2020, the $27.7 billion deal wasn't complete when signatures hit the paper. The real work began immediately after, with integration teams, communication protocols, and relationship management that would determine whether the massive investment would pay off. Most people think negotiations end with handshakes, but smart dealmakers know the opposite is true. The follow-up phase separates amateur negotiators from professionals. Research from Harvard Business School shows that 60% of merger value is created or destroyed in the first 100 days after signing. Yet most negotiators spend months preparing for talks and mere hours planning what happens next. This oversight costs money, relationships, and future opportunities. Documentation becomes your first priority. Chris Voss, the former FBI negotiator, always sent written summaries within 24 hours of any significant conversation. His emails began with phrases like, "Based on our discussion, I understand that." This technique, called labeling, forces both parties to clarify misunderstandings before they become problems. When details remain fuzzy, assumptions multiply. One party thinks delivery means Thursday, while the other expects Friday, creating friction that could have been avoided with simple confirmation. Smart follow-up goes beyond paperwork. Toyota's partnership with Tesla began with a small battery supply agreement in 2010. Both companies invested heavily in relationship maintenance, with regular check-ins, joint problem-solving sessions, and transparent communication about challenges. When Tesla needed additional support during Model S production, Toyota readily expanded their collaboration. The initial deal became the foundation for years of mutual benefit, because both sides treated the agreement as the beginning, not the end. Problems will emerge. Count on it. The difference between successful and failed negotiations often lies in how parties handle these inevitable issues. When Airbnb faced regulatory challenges in New York City, their approach shifted from confrontation to collaboration. They established regular communication channels with city officials, provided detailed data about their operations, and proactively addressed concerns. This follow-up strategy transformed adversarial relationships into productive partnerships. Timing matters in follow-up just as much as in initial negotiations. Stuart Diamond's research reveals that people are most receptive to additional requests within the first week after reaching agreement. The goodwill from successful negotiation creates a window of opportunity. Smart negotiators use this period to solidify relationships, clarify next steps, and sometimes introduce additional elements that benefit both parties. Follow-up also means monitoring results and celebrating successes together. When Southwest Airlines negotiated fuel hedging contracts in the early 2000s, they didn't just track savings internally. They shared success stories with their counterparts, reinforcing the value of their partnerships. This transparency led to preferential treatment and better terms in subsequent negotiations. Every negotiation plants seeds for future opportunities. The vendor you work with today might become tomorrow's strategic partner. The candidate you don't hire might refer the perfect person next year. Professional follow-up keeps these doors open, transforming single transactions into lasting business relationships that compound over time. Chapter 5: Negotiation in a Chaotic World. Part 1: Improvising Solutions. When Netflix faced widespread criticism over its 2011 decision to split its DVD and streaming services into separate companies, CEO Reed Hastings could have doubled down on the original plan. Instead, he demonstrated the power of creative adaptation by quickly reversing course, acknowledging the mistake, and refocusing on what customers actually wanted. This moment illustrates why successful negotiators must master the art of improvisation when their carefully crafted strategies hit unexpected roadblocks. Traditional negotiation training often emphasizes preparation and strategy. Yet research from Harvard Business School shows that over 70% of negotiations encounter significant deviations from initial plans. The most successful outcomes emerge not from rigid adherence to original positions, but from the ability to think creatively under pressure and adapt to changing circumstances. Consider how Southwest Airlines transformed a potential disaster into a competitive advantage. In 1971, when larger airlines sued to prevent Southwest from operating, the company's legal team could have fought a prolonged court battle. Instead, they improvised a brilliant solution. They reframed their entire business model around intrastate flights, avoiding federal regulations entirely. This creative pivot became the foundation of their low-cost strategy that revolutionized air travel. The key difference between successful and struggling negotiators often lies in their response to stalled conversations. When Disney's acquisition talks with Pixar reached an impasse in 2005, traditional approaches suggested walking away or applying pressure. Instead, Disney's team shifted tactics completely, focusing on creative partnerships and shared artistic vision rather than just financial terms. This improvisational approach ultimately led to the $7.4 billion acquisition that transformed both companies. Tactical improvisation requires specific skills that can be developed through practice. Start by reframing problems as opportunities for creative solutions. When negotiations stall, ask yourself, what would success look like if we approach this completely differently? This simple question shift activates different neural pathways and opens new possibilities. Create space for brainstorming by temporarily suspending judgment about feasibility. IBM's successful turnaround in the 1990s began when CEO Lou Gerstner encouraged teams to propose seemingly impossible solutions to customer problems. Many of these impossible ideas became breakthrough services that repositioned IBM as a consulting powerhouse. Practice the yes and technique borrowed from improvisational theater. When faced with unexpected proposals or objections, respond with curiosity rather than immediate rejection. This approach helped Starbucks navigate complex real estate negotiations by building on landlords' concerns rather than dismissing them, ultimately securing prime locations at favorable terms. The most adaptable negotiators also cultivate comfort with uncertainty. They view setbacks not as failures, but as information that can inform better solutions. This mindset shift transforms negotiation from a win-lose battle into a collaborative problem-solving exercise where creative thinking becomes your most valuable asset. Remember that improvisation isn't about abandoning preparation. It's about using your foundational knowledge as a launching pad for creative solutions that neither side initially imagined possible. Part 2. Negotiating with the Unexpected. When IBM's executives walked into negotiations to sell their PC division to Lenovo in 2005, they thought they understood the deal parameters. Then Lenovo's team arrived with an unexpected demand. They wanted IBM's entire ThinkPad brand and ongoing technical support for 5 years. The curveball forced IBM to completely restructure their approach, ultimately leading to a $1.75 billion deal that neither side had initially envisioned. Successful negotiators prepare not just for what they expect, but for what they cannot predict. Chris Voss learned this lesson repeatedly during hostage negotiations, where a single unexpected demand could derail months of careful planning. He discovered that the most dangerous moments often came not from known adversaries, but from sudden shifts, a new decision-maker entering the room, external pressure from media, or previously unknown constraints surfacing at critical moments. The key lies in building what negotiation experts call tactical flexibility into your preparation. Before entering any significant negotiation, identify 3 potential disruptions that could occur and develop response frameworks for each. When Disney negotiated with Pixar in 2006, Steve Jobs surprised executives by demanding not just a distribution deal, but creative control over marketing, something Disney had never conceded. Their ability to adapt quickly to this unexpected demand ultimately preserved the relationship and led to Disney's eventual acquisition of Pixar. Consider the negotiator as a jazz musician who knows the song but must improvise when other musicians change tempo or key. Your foundational preparation becomes the melody, but your ability to respond to surprises determines whether the performance succeeds or fails. This means developing comfort with ambiguity and training yourself to view disruptions as information rather than obstacles. Practical preparation involves scenario planning with specific contingencies. What happens if a key decision-maker leaves mid-negotiation? How do you respond when the other party introduces completely new terms? Experienced negotiators create if-then protocols for common surprises. If new stakeholders appear, then request a brief recess to understand their interests. If external events change the context, then acknowledge the shift openly and explore how it affects both parties. The most resilient negotiators also cultivate relationships that can withstand unexpected pressure. When Southwest Airlines faced post-9/11 negotiations with aircraft manufacturers, their existing relationships with Boeing allowed both sides to navigate unprecedented circumstances through honest communication about mutual survival needs. Remember that your response to surprises often matters more than the surprises themselves. Quick adaptation signals competence and builds trust, while rigid reactions to unexpected developments can destroy months of careful relationship building. The negotiator who remains curious about new information, even when it complicates their original plan, often discovers opportunities that rigid planning would have missed entirely. Part 3. Dealmaking in crowded rooms. Walking into a boardroom filled with 12 competing interests feels like entering a diplomatic minefield. Each person arrives with hidden agendas, cultural blind spots, and pressure from their own stakeholders. Yet, these crowded negotiations often produce the most innovative solutions precisely because they force creative problem-solving when simple bilateral discussions would fail. The 2015 Paris Climate Agreement negotiations exemplified this complexity. With 196 countries, countless NGOs, and industry representatives, the room buzzed with competing priorities. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius succeeded by mapping the intricate web of relationships before formal talks began. He identified which nations could influence others, which issues truly mattered to each delegation, and where unexpected alliances might form. The breakthrough came when small island nations partnered with ambitious European countries to pressure larger economies, creating momentum that bilateral discussions never could have achieved. Managing group dynamics requires recognizing that every crowded room contains multiple simultaneous negotiations. When Satya Nadella transformed Microsoft's culture, he faced resistance from various department heads during leadership meetings. Rather than addressing each concern individually, he identified the informal influencers who could sway others. By securing buy-in from respected engineering leaders first, he created a coalition that naturally influenced skeptical divisions. The key was understanding that winning over 3 influential voices often matters more than convincing 10 passive participants. Cultural differences amplify complexity exponentially. During Toyota's joint venture negotiations with General Motors in the 1980s, American executives focused on legal frameworks, while Japanese counterparts emphasized relationship building through shared meals and informal conversations. The successful negotiators learned to code switch between communication styles within the same meeting, addressing American concerns about timelines during formal sessions while building trust with Japanese partners during breaks. Ensuring your voice cuts through the noise requires strategic positioning rather than volume. Elizabeth Warren's effectiveness in Senate hearings demonstrates this principle. She asks precise questions that force clear responses, creating moments where complex issues become binary choices that other participants must address directly. This technique works because it transforms chaotic multi-party discussions into focused decision points. Coalition building becomes essential when formal authority lacks sufficient power. During the 2008 financial crisis negotiations, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson couldn't simply dictate terms to bank CEOs. Instead, he privately secured commitments from J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs first, then used their participation to pressure remaining institutions. The early adopters became advocates rather than obstacles, fundamentally changing the room's dynamics. The most successful crowded room negotiators embrace controlled chaos. They prepare for multiple scenarios, identify decision-makers behind the official representatives, and remain flexible enough to recognize unexpected opportunities when competing interests suddenly align. These complex environments reward preparation and adaptability over rigid adherence to predetermined strategies. Part 4. Writing Your Own Ending. When Jeff Bezos faced the 2013 Washington Post acquisition negotiations, he didn't just buy a newspaper. He rewrote how media deals get done. Instead of accepting the Graham family's initial reluctance, he treated their no as the opening scene of a longer story that he intended to shape. Most negotiators approach each interaction as a standalone event, hoping for immediate success while dreading potential failure. This perspective creates unnecessary pressure and limits learning opportunities. Consider how Warren Buffett views his investment negotiations differently. After Berkshire Hathaway's failed bid for McDonald's in the 1990s, Buffett didn't see defeat. He documented what went wrong, adjusted his approach, and later successfully acquired Dairy Queen, using lessons learned from that earlier experience. The most effective negotiators treat every interaction as one chapter in their ongoing professional development story. They establish clear objectives before entering any negotiation room, then systematically evaluate their performance afterward. Sarah Blakely, Spanx founder, credits her negotiation success to this practice. She maintains detailed notes after every major business conversation, analyzing what worked, what didn't, and how she can improve next time. This approach requires establishing specific, measurable goals beyond just get a good deal. Netflix's Reed Hastings demonstrated this during content licensing negotiations with Disney. Rather than simply securing streaming rights, he set broader objectives about learning Disney's decision-making process, understanding their strategic priorities, and building relationships for future deals. When Disney later launched Disney Plus, that foundation of understanding helped Netflix adapt their content strategy more effectively. Creating your own feedback loop means asking tough questions after each negotiation concludes. What assumptions proved incorrect? Which preparation elements helped most? Where did emotional responses override strategic thinking? Oprah Winfrey's team famously conducts post-negotiation reviews after major contract discussions, treating each experience as valuable data for future interactions. The difference between settling and succeeding often lies in perspective. When Tesla's early investment rounds faced multiple rejections, Elon Musk didn't accept those outcomes as final verdicts. He analyzed each investor's concerns, refined his pitch, and eventually secured funding from Daimler and Toyota by addressing specific issues raised in earlier conversations. This mindset transforms failure from an ending into valuable intelligence. Every no becomes research about what doesn't work. Every compromise teaches lessons about priorities and leverage. Every successful agreement reveals patterns worth replicating. Your negotiation story continues writing itself with each interaction. The question isn't whether you'll face setbacks or achieve perfect outcomes. Instead, ask yourself, what will you learn from this chapter? And how will that knowledge shape your next one?